We have Julia Altemus, who's with us today, Executive Vice President of the Montana Wood Products Association, and our good friend, Dr. Peter Kolb, who is a professor at the University of Montana. And we got some big issues going on that both of you folks, we're hoping that you can enlighten us about. We heard that one of the big, Tricon Timber, lost 93 full-time positions because of something that took a lot of people by surprise in western Montana. You get this big news that the largest employer in a small Montana town, 93 jobs out the window. My goodness. So tell us, first of all, Julia, welcome to the show, and tell us what's happening here.
Well, thank you, Peter and John. Yeah, so it's all market-driven right now. As you're probably aware, or some people are starting to realize, that the Canadian Softwood Lumber Agreement will expire on October 12th, which is next week, I believe. And this latest one's been in place since 2006. I mean, we actually put one in place towards the end of the 1990s as well. So this has been a trade issue between the U.S. and Canada for 30-some-odd years. It's been difficult. But it will expire, and so that means that the tariff that has been charged to the Canadians if they come bring their product across the border will also expire. And right now with the exchange rate, they're making $1.23 on their investment, just because of the way the exchange rate is. So, traditionally they have, exported about 50% of their timber comes into the United States, and we consume about 30% of that. And it changed during the Great Recession. It wasn't quite as bad, but it's creeping back up again to that 50-30.
I got to ask you, so why is the softwood lumber agreement coming to an end? I think you mentioned 2006, and then I think it was renewed in 2009 or somewhere.
14, that was renewed for a year. Yeah.
So why can't the heads get together and renew it again?
There's not a lot of incentive for the Canadian government to do that. I mean, right now they're actually without Parliament because they're in the process of having their elections. So there's three parties running up in Canada, their elections on October 19th. So there's really nobody even to talk to. But there's not a lot of incentive because they're making money. So the agreement to extend it makes no sense for the U.S. companies because it's hurting us right now. So we need a new agreement. And we're in a one-year stand-down. That was part of the agreement. Nothing can happen for a year, which is, further complicates the issue.
So do you think this new future where we don't have any agreement is worse than the current agreement? Or is it about the same?
It'll be worse.
It'll be worse.
Yeah, because right now what they're doing is affecting the lumber prices. So lumber futures are the lowest they've been since the 80s. I mean, the lumber futures are almost in the tank, and they're going to probably go down more as well.
One of the times I first met you was I was visiting, I believe, over at Roseburg, when then Congressman Steve Daines came in to talk and had a kind of a roundtable discussion of local timber producers and folks that had family mills for generations and generations. And one after another, boom, 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 these tales of woe of how Libby, at one time Libby was a AA school with, a high school of well over 1,200 kids. Now the Libby loggers can barely field a team. The Libby loggers. And our forest-based economy is already in shambles. So is this just going to make it worse?
Well, it has been. Sorry, Peter. It has been.
Okay.
That's the markets are the direct result of why Tricon had to go from 2 shifts. They were the last mill in Montana to run 2 shifts, so they're now down to 1. Most of the mills are down to 1. A couple of the mills are running 50 hours a week instead of 40, but not 2 shifts. So we're at about 50-55% capacity when we should be hopefully at 100%. So yeah, and for timber-dependent communities, this is a big deal. It hurts my heart every single time somebody has to lay people off or close down a mill. It's not good because it has a ripple effect. I mean, the loggers are idle. Our economy suffers because we're a $1 billion industry in the state of Montana alone.
Or at least were.
And
okay.
That will probably change this year. But
yeah, Peter or Julia, either one can answer this question. What is a realistic future for this industry? We've talked about a bit of a decline over the past, but set my children and their grandchildren's expectations at a reasonable level. What do you see in the future for the timber industry in Montana?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom because, like I said, this is market related. So, and it's always about supply. Supply, if we had more supply of federal timberlands, then what we call stumpage prices, which are high right now, will come down because of supply and demand. So they will come down. They'll be closer to what lumber futures are. That would sustain the mills. But right now, that gap is too great. Stumpage is high and lumber prices are low. We are selling lumber. It's not that we're not selling it, but we are selling lumber. But the Canadian government, the Canadian industry is undercutting what we do.
It sounds to me like the Canadian government is doing all it can to promote its timber industry, while the United States federal government is saying, I know that's oversimplification. Am I right or not?
No, you're right.
Okay.
I don't think I'll.
Can we make that a campaign slogan somehow? Yeah. Stop saying to the timber industry, right?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Peter. I'll let you answer.
Well, grab that. Yeah.
You also want to consider that Canada's government lands, it's usually provincial, but some of it is national as well, have a mandate under their forested lands to support and promote their wood products industry. It's written into their mandate of managing their lands, which is a little different than ours, which is
just a little.
But as Julia said, you look at the future and the markets. It's an international market now too, and with China's economic downturn, Canada was selling an awful lot of lumber to China, and now China's not going to buy that much anymore. So they, of course, want to keep their economy alive, and the danger is they're going to dump a lot of lumber onto the U.S. market. And that is of a concern. Now, this last agreement, just to clarify a little bit, it was prorated based on our composite price of lumber. So when our prices were low, so that they didn't unfairly compete with U.S. markets because their timber prices are set by administration, not by market. So it's a sort of a subsidy. That when our prices were low, they would have to pay a higher tariff so that they wouldn't unfairly compete with American markets. When prices were high, they wouldn't have to pay a tariff. And some have mentioned that, well, in the last 2 years, they haven't been paying a tariff because our prices were high, but now the last couple of months, our prices have tanked. And, and that's a little bit of a weird thing because a number of building permits, wood use is tied to houses being built. And building permits are pretty high, but the actual construction has not been taking place, and some blame it on weather conditions and things like that.
Global warming or whatever.
But also, you apply for a building permit, but whether or not you're actually going to invest in the building is also determined by the tone of the economy in general. And so if people don't have confidence in the economy, they may not want to, even though they have that permit, they may not want to take out a huge mortgage to build that new house. So there's a whole lot of factors that are playing into this.
One of the things I wanted to ask, some of the big threats so far that we've talked about, big surplus because China's decreased its building. Canada and U.S. have oversupply, so we can't sell our timber for as much as we used to. Obviously, this trade agreement going sour, that's another big threat. One of the things I was curious about is there's these TPP negotiations going on. Is the wood products involved at all in that? And where does the wood products industry stand on that?
John, well, yes, we have 2 board members that sit on the Canadian Softwood Lumber Board, which is part of that negotiations. So indirectly, it's not something that I do. It's not part of my job description to work on that. Trade issues are tough, especially with a neighbor that's been friendly, even though it has been the longest standing trade issue that we've ever had with the United States. But, it is a friendly country. They're not Iran. So it's trade issues are tough.
All right, let's get to the phones. Grab your headphones there, and we have Larry who wants to visit with you guys, so we'll get them headphoned up. And Larry, you're on Talkback with Julia and Peter. Go ahead.
Good morning. I had a couple of questions. I was away from my radio, so I heard you talking about trade agreements, and maybe this has already been discussed, but I wondered whether that Pacific Rim trade agreement had any impact on the price, and also will this downturn in the economy have any impact on the pulp prices? I see the yard over at Bonner is quite full of logs, but I just wondered if that'll have any impact.
Okay, thanks, Larry. So, Julia, go ahead.
Sure. So I'll answer your last question first. So if we are not harvesting, if we're down to one shift, pretty much per mill, and they're not harvesting as much timber because there's one shift, it definitely will affect the residuals that go into the Bonner mill. But they can also take, some of the non-commercial timber. So it will affect them some. It's really more about what loggers might be idle and, what they're willing to do. I know that Willis is going to have a procurement or they're having a meeting on the 20th of October to talk about their suppliers, to talk to them about how they're going to move forward. So
No, I'm sorry. Who is Willis?
Willis Enterprises.
Okay.
They are the folks out at the Bonner Mill.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And they chip and they send over to Alula, which is a paper packaging company in Washington.
Okay, Peter?
Well, I just say that the chip market is based on the demand for paper. And mainly what we're talking about here is the demand for dimension lumber for building purposes. And so they're different markets. But the Bonner plant, I know Rich Lane real well, who's the procurement forester there. They're always looking for logs. They're under a pretty stringent contract to supply Wallula with enough chips for paper pulping. And so he's always looking for logs because again, the shortages or the lack of availability of timber sales affects them just as much as it does sawmills.
So basically, it depends on the specialty that the mill has set for itself. Now, is it possible for a mill who is working with dimensional timber for homes and stuff to switch over to do the other, or is that an amazingly expensive procedure?
No, it's amazingly expensive. That's not going to happen. They they have a huge capital investment.
You can't just flip a switch and say, no, we're going to just do the other stuff now.
They can flip a switch on a lot of the mills to do metrics if they want to sell into other markets, but not to completely shift products. No.
Okay.
Now you got to consider that today's mills are extremely technologically advanced, and they're making a specialty product. So it takes a log probably about 10 seconds to go through and end up as a finished product, and that's how these mills stay competitive against other structures. I mean, they're very efficient and they're very geared at certain products, and so it's very difficult for them to switch over.
Okay, let's get Emmett on the line. Emmett, you are on with Julia and Peter. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for taking my call. This might have already been discussed earlier. I don't know, but it's a fascinating topic, but we've talked about environmentalists and environmental issues in the past, and we've had environmentalists, try to shut down timber things and this kind of thing. Does any of this, the shutting down of the mills, have to do with the environmentalists, their regulations or protests or whatever? Because a lot of environmentalists think that even timber harvesting is horrible. Is that a factor or not? Please let me know.
Thanks, Emmett.
Well, I'd be happy to answer some of that. Certainly it affects supply. As I mentioned earlier, this is always about supply. It's always about markets because we are, we're a market-driven economy where Canada is not. So when their supply is curtailed because of environmental regulations or lawsuits or whatever, that directly has an impact. And so that has already shrunk our capacity. So now we have a market-driven issue coming in, which is pretty huge, which is further constraining what we're doing. So it's all tied, and it's very complicated.
And just for clarification, we use the term environmentalists. The folks that are shutting down timber sales are not environmentalists. They're special interest groups. Environmentalists are people who want to take a scientific approach to looking at the environment and how do we make it a better place. Special interest groups that are those that have a political agenda that want to shut down a particular practice because somehow it violates their sense of what's real or what's right.
I wanted to ask you this because we kind of see this across the border. Canada's not that far away. It's really not that different. If you travel up there, the woods kind of look the same. The environment's pretty similar. The people are pretty similar. I mean, there's an A or difference here and French is around, but other than that, it's pretty similar. But obviously, the way that we manage our forests is very different between Canada and the U.S. Now, I got to say, I'm all for markets. I like free markets. I think that they're better for the consumer, and they make a real price of things. But do you think that America should change the way it manages its forests in any way? And do you really believe that we have a free market price in America, or are certain things constraining or artificially inflating or deflating the price here in the States?
Those are some interesting and loaded questions. Peter, do you want to go first, or I can go first?
Please, Julia.
Okay. So, I mean, yeah, there's always artificial things that are built into markets. I mean, that's just the way our economy works. But So, I mean, as a country, do you make the same decisions that we have made for the farm and ranch industry? I mean, they're heavily subsidized, but, the timber industry is not. So, we made that decision a long time ago as a nation to keep the farmers, the family farmer, on the landscape. We've not made that same decision for the timber industry. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But, we continue to try to weave our way through all the landmines that exist to keep the timber industry, here on the landscape as well. But we do have to compete with world markets. And the China thing has an effect, and the Canadian setting prices has an effect. Right now, Chile and some of the South American countries as well are dumping into the United States too. Not nearly to the extent that Canada is, but they are.
Well, and you have to think of how different economies manipulate their money. I mean, we all heard that China devalued their currency. Well, that makes export for us into China much more difficult because we get a lot less return on what we send them. So, and hence, even though Canada didn't do that, the valuation between the Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar right now makes for Canadian export in the United States very lucrative because, what is it right now, 1.3 Canadian dollars per U.S. dollar.
No, it's 1.23. As of this morning, it's 1.23.
Yeah, so, when they get, basically what they pay for things doesn't change in their local economy, but what they can bring from the United States or what they send to the U.S. makes them a lot more money when their dollar is weaker than ours.
Now, I asked Julia during the break if you could open up your cabinet of wishes and wave your magic wand and say if there's one thing that either the state of Montana or the federal government could do today or tomorrow to try to help the folks, up in St. Regis or the folks in the northern part of like Libby, whatever, to help bring some of those jobs back, what would it be?
Well, there's a couple of things, actually. I'm not sure how much you're aware of the Governor's Forest and Focus program. And so back in 2013, the state legislature passed House Bill 354, which was a bill that set aside $5 million per biennium for fuel reduction, depending on how much money is in the coffers as far as fire suppression goes. I believe, and I could be wrong, but I think we're around $70 or $80 million right now sitting in the fire suppression fund. So we're in a new biennium. There's another $5 million that's open for the next 2 years. If we could take the whole $5 million right now and put it into what I'm going to call another Jumpstart 4 or Forest and Focus projects where we're getting loggers to work, we're managing private timber.
And what would you do with that process, with that timber, harvested timber?
We would run it through the mills and put people back to work, and $5 million in western Montana around the mills would actually produce quite a bit of. It's usually about, Peter, help me, I think it's usually 17 jobs per 1 million board foot harvested, and $5 million would probably, I think when we spent $8 million one time on Jumpstart, we had harvested about, I want to say 5,000 acres worth of timber.
So are these mostly fuel reduction projects?
They are. Yeah, they would be fuel reduction projects, but we'd be, not just going after, non-mergeable or submergible timber. It would be saw log volume as well. I mean, it would be an opportunity for private landowners to actually take advantage of the fact that the market's not real good and go ahead and do some land management work.
Now, for those of us who don't know, who have never worked in the timber industry or the lumber industry before, give us an idea of what the annual income is for somebody who works full time at like St. Regis or Bonner or whatever. Is it a good wage, or is it subsistence, or what?
It averages between $50,000 a year to $80,000 a year, depending on how technical your job is. But they're sustainable jobs. Yeah,
they're some of the highest paid workers in the rural communities, and so they're not getting rich, but they would be what we call middle income family jobs.
Okay, well let's get Garth on the phone. You guys have your headphones on. Garth, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Good morning. It's nice to hear you. Say, I didn't hear the whole show. I'm sorry, but I did hear one statement, and I guess it was yours. You asked very politely. What could the government do to help us? That's the first statement that I don't like. Why does the government have to help us? Leave it alone in Montana and get the hell out.
Well, Garth, the reason I asked that is because the federal government controls all the access to the lands where the wood is.
Get them out of there. Let's vote them out some damn way. We don't need the government telling us in Montana what to do. I got to shut up before I have a heart attack.
Okay, Garth, thanks for the call. Wow. Okay.
Oh, wow.
He's usually, so mild. But
Yeah, well,
anyway.
you just have to realize that when you have an entity, Freudian slip there, an entity such as the federal government that controls the resource, they have to be involved one way or another. And I also just wanted to add, we're talking about mills here, but we can't forget about the logging community that's out there too, because every logging contractor out there has millions of dollars invested in their equipment today. I mean, to be an effective logger, you need a forwarder, you need a mechanical harvester, you need logging trucks. So you're looking at millions of dollars investment that are also bought on loans and need to be paid off. And the only way they're paid off is if these folks are working. And so when the mills aren't buying logs, these guys are not working, or gals. And so you have some of the most highly skilled logging workforce that can comply with all of the environmental standards that we've imposed on them now. And if they go out of business, you're not going to get them back. And so, there's much more to this than just a mill not buying logs and laying off workers.
And now, Julia, you had said that there was something the federal government could do to try to help things along, right?
Yeah, correct. So there are actually two things. The Wood Products Association has written and requested that the Chief of the Forest Service and the Director of BLM allow for contract term adjustments with the current federal sales that are out there, just to allow more time for the market to recover. Because if they had to call those loans due right now, or those timber sales due right now, the gap between, like I said, stumpage prices and lumber prices is just too great. So you could probably see more layoffs. So that's one thing. We have not yet to hear back. Our congressional delegation also all of them sent letters as well. The other thing, as I mentioned, is that we are in a stand down now. As of October 13th, we will be in a 1-year stand down. So what happens? And we need the government to engage, State Department, our government, to engage with the Canadian government and the Canadian industry, timber industry, to start the renegotiation of the agreement and not wait for the year. If we can't get them to engage, they're forcing us to file claims and lawsuits, and that will be our only recourse at that point.
Yeah, so rather than seeing 100 logging trucks lining up at the Canadian-American border, just waiting for that to expire and in they come, right?
Correct.
So, okay. Let's get Mike on the line. Mike, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I just, so far, all I've heard you talk about this morning is how we need to, get more trees cut down and all this other stuff, and more jobs. But what I would like to hear you talk about is how you replenish what you've cut, because I think the general public, when they hear, oh, we're going to get more logging trucks going, we're going to get more mills up and more jobs, what they hear is, oh, we're going to cut more trees down, and pretty soon we won't have any more trees. So could you just address how you replenish the forest after you've cut and start growing the trees again? I think that would help people understand better about what logging really is.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. So it's kind of like Doritos. We'll make more. Is that it?
Well, yeah. Let me clarify a few things in here, and you got to consider the ecology of northern Rocky forests. Okay, they are a forest that evolved with disturbances. Fire being one of them. Logging is also a disturbance, and I work with a lot of ranchers, a lot of private landowners, and honestly, and I might get chastised for this, but trees act a lot like weeds. I mean, you cannot keep them from regenerating areas. So when we go in there and harvest an area, first of all, it's done with a silvicultural prescription, which is planning so that you ensure good tree regeneration. In a lot of cases, one of the problems is you get so much tree regeneration after harvest that you have to spend money to go back and thin it to prevent a fire hazard from being created, or the trees themselves stagnating where they compete with each other to such a degree that they don't grow. So typically in Montana, regenerating harvest units is not an issue. Getting too much regeneration is the issue, and one of the major expenses with forest management.
You had also mentioned that when wildfire occurs in these national forests, what happens then? You get an unequal or an unnatural return of different kinds of trees, right?
Well, no, not exactly, but basically fire varies a lot based on climate, and our climate has varied a lot over the last 13,000 years, which is where we consider our stable system. I mean, it's hot and dry, it's cold, wet, it's hot and dry, it's cold, wet. I mean, consider the 1910 fires burning 3 million acres in a couple of weeks. But most of the northern Rockies are characterized by fragmented forests from fires that created species variability where they regenerate at different ages and different species. What we're seeing now with our warming trend and the fires is they're large landscape-level events that kill all the trees on there, and they simplify these ecosystems. And I'd encourage folks, if you get a chance, drive up Copper Creek drainage, just east of Lincoln. That's about a 30-mile-long drainage that pretty much with the summer fires that burned the lower end, the entire drainage has burned. And the only place you see green patches are on past harvest units because the younger trees that have regenerated these past harvest units are not as flammable as the older forest ecosystems where you have a lot of woody debris and drought-stressed trees. So, you know, the notion that when you harvest an area of trees, that it is now devastated and no trees will ever grow there unless you take extraordinary efforts to get trees back is actually a very false notion. It's trying to plan for what kind of tree regeneration so that you get the species that help diversify the landscape, help increase wildlife habitat, and give you a more resilient forest landscape than what these megafires of today are leaving us.
So that's basically called fire science, right, or forestry science?
Well, it's a combination of forest ecology, right, what we call silviculture, logging operations. I mean, it's all of it combined into one. It's a complex process that uses all of the science, which is a huge body of knowledge these days, to come up with a logging prescription that leaves you with the best outcome afterwards. Because
most folks, I think that the average folks are driving around thinking about logging. They go, clear cut bad, because you would hear this great big beautiful forest and there's nothing but not a bald place where you've cut down all the trees and killed all the animals and polluted all the streams. But what you're saying is when it's done right, that can be the healthiest part of the forest, right?
Well, correctly. I mean, you're assessing a landscape and you're planning your harvests to improve the diversity of the landscape. Now, there are areas of the United States that were often shown where the entire landscape, as far as the eye can see, was nothing but a large clear cut. That's also simplifying the forest, and that in itself is a bad practice. Clear cutting as a practice is a viable tool, particularly in forests that experience stand-replacing fires. It emulates what stand-replacing fires do. Now, we can do better in that we don't put squares on the landscape. We create an irregular patch that emulates what a fire has done in the past. But if we do that in a controlled circumstance, rather than letting whims of nature determine whether it's a mass landscape conflagration or whether it's actually a smaller, patchy type of fire, can be determined on how we manage those fuels out there, and harvesting is a way of managing fuels.
You just brought up a very interesting point about fire. You had mentioned the amount of fire and the amount of forests in Montana that have been affected. Could you hit that for us so everybody can hear what you said?
Sure. Well, since 2000, I've been keeping a tally of acres burned just across Montana. And when you consider that we have 25 million acres of forested landscape, this year we hit that number where right now 1/5 of the entire forested landscape in Montana has burned in only the last 15 years. So that's not a sustainable level of burning.
All right, let's go ahead.
Real quick, if you could give us a quick perspective on the number of mills in Montana, just so people that don't watch this industry closely kind of get a grasp of where it's been and where it's going.
I'd like to defer that to Julia.
Sure. So currently we have about 8 what we would call primary facilities that are producing dimensional lumber. Pretty much in western Montana. Our White Timber has one in Townsend outside of Helena. They also have a facility in Livingston. So that's about the farthest east that we have a mill. But since the 80s, we have lost 26 mills.
Wow.
26 mills since about 1985.
So what's the total economic impact? We're talking billions, millions, what? How much?
Well, currently, until this recent downturn, we were a $1 billion economic engine to the state of Montana currently. So I know 30 years ago when I started my career, I believe it was mining. It was agriculture, and then it was timber, then it was mining, then it was tourism, and I believe tourism is now second. But I would say that, timber has now dropped about third or fourth in the state as well.
Okay, let's get, we have a couple more callers here. So, Alan, you're up first on Talkback. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Peter, I got 2 questions. First, why is the price of a 12-inch board so much greater now than a 2x4 or even a 2x6?
Well, you're looking at different requirements for wood quality. You can cut a 2x4 that's only used mainly for structural purposes out of almost the nastiest, gnarliest, smallest diameter log. Where if you need a 12-inch wide board that's relatively knot-free to give it a good appearance and good strength, you need at least a 16-inch diameter log to get that out of. And so that log is more expensive, and a clear log like that is harder to find.
And yeah, that's getting very hard to find. Now, you referenced 13,000 years ago. Are you familiar with, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name of the writer right, David Alt's book?
Not offhand.
Well, David Alt was a professor of geology at the University of Montana. I don't know if he's still there or not. But he wrote a book called Glacier Lake, Missoula, and its Humongous Floods. You might want to read that. It's very informative. He talks about the last ice age and how the climate changed abruptly 13,000 years ago, and the glaciers all melted within 3,000 years. And you referenced that 13,000 year point, and I thought that was interesting because he said that's when the climate abruptly changed and started warming again. And the climate's been warming ever since that time. There was just a brief period called the Little Ice Age when the climate had cooled, and I thought you might find that very interesting from the aspect of what you talked about.
Okay, hey, Talon, thanks for the call. So,
yeah, there's an awful lot of literature on our past climate, and our climate is always fluctuating. I mean, if you look at those reconstructions, the current climatic period we're coming out of called the Mini Ice Age really started about at 1300 AD, and it was a very prolonged cool, wet period. I mean, prior to that, we were warmer and drier for most of the last 13,000 years. But there's a lot of literature, and that's a topic for a Talkback presentation all onto itself.
Right. And of course, since having lived through it, I could probably give a personal example. Let's try to get one. We have like a minute and a half. Marilyn, real quickly, what's your question?
Okay. Well, we all know that the federal government owns a lot of land in the West here, and we also know that the state is a better manager of the land than the federal government, and we know that there's an effort going on to try and get more land into the state's hands and privately owned. So, tie it to the school bond issue, I mean, that timber harvest by state lands goes to the schools. So, give me your opinion on, wouldn't it be better to get more of that federal land into the state ownership?
Okay, let's. I'm sorry, Marilyn. We're just running so short of time. We have like a minute. So, do you want to tackle that, Julia? Go ahead.
I will try to do it in a minute. So, for the timber industry, there's too many things that come. There's baggage that comes with that kind of an effort, so two things would happen. One is the timber industry has been hit really hard in the Ninth Circuit by a lot of litigation over the last 20-25 years. That will not go away. So unless Congress were to completely wipe the slate clean of all precedent-setting, decisions that have come out of the courts, whether it's judicial or the Ninth Circuit, and if they were to abate ESA and abate NEPA and do everything that that we as a timber industry has to abide by, that's one thing. Okay, that's one thing. Let's say they do that. They wipe the slate clean. You cannot tell me that our detractors or we're going to say the serial litigators would not have us in court for the next 15 or 20 years, would completely shut down the timber industry. The Clinton inventory roadless rule in 2000, 15 years ago, is still in court.
All right. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Julia and Peter. We really appreciate you being with us. And what's coming up real quick tomorrow?
Open phones.
Open phones. Have a great day, everybody. And, stay dry.